Good morning and welcome to the New Testament and in particular to Matthew's Gospel. We're going to do Matthew's Gospel in two videos. To be honest, I could have taken 20 or 40 to do it because it is so rich and so deep, but I'm going to be very restrained and I'm going to just do two. So welcome to the first of the videos on Matthew. So with each gospel, I'm going to try and make some general comments each time, some different general comments each time about the gospels and about how to read them well. So let me just say something about what a gospel is. A gospel is kind of, you could say it's a biography of Jesus Christ. But the Gospels, one of the things we really need to understand, and actually we hinted at this when we were looking at some of the narratives, I think, of the Old Testament weeks ago. The Gospels are written that you might believe, as the Gospel of John tells us. They are written by passionate followers of Jesus Christ who are very keen that the reader also becomes or continues to be a passionate follower of Jesus Christ. So they are written for a purpose, and their material is organised in order to say something particular about Jesus. Jesus is always the subject of the Gospels. The Gospel writers themselves disappear into the background. Obviously, there are other characters and they matter and there are things to learn from them, but Jesus is the subject of the Gospels. Gospel, of course, the term gospel means good news, and our Gospel writers believe that the coming of Jesus Christ is good news and want you to believe it as well. So these are not calm, neutral, kind of dispassionate accounts of this Galilean rabbi. These are passionate accounts of followers of Jesus. That's the first thing to say. I suppose related to that is to say that this is not to suggest that these, I don't believe that these are inaccurate or unfaithful representations of Jesus, but that they are written with that purpose and the material is organised to make particular points. Now, each of the Gospel writers has something particular that they want you to know about Jesus. And here's the first tip for reading the Gospels. If we kind of take the Gospels and put them in a blender, or four of them, and then smush them together and then extract the bits, then what we lose is we lose the particularity of each Gospel. And each Gospel writer has chosen his material because there's so much he could have chosen. He's chosen the bits he wants to use, and he's presented his material in a particular way. And as soon as you kind of get the blender out, then you fail to notice what's been chosen and perhaps what's been left out, or you fail to notice where things have been placed in the Gospel because you've blended them together, and then the Gospel doesn't speak to you as powerfully. So my top tip today for reading the Gospels is allow each Gospel to speak for itself and resist the temptation when you're studying or when you're preaching to flip back and forth between the Gospels. Allow Matthew, today we're in Matthew, allow Matthew to tell you what Matthew wants to tell you about Jesus. And more powerful things will emerge when you do that, I think. Now, speaking of Matthew, who wrote this Gospel? So the Matthew does not claim authorship within the Gospel itself. So we are looking at what's called external evidence. Now, it's traditionally believed to have been written by Matthew, who was also known as Levi, the tax collector. And we don't know for sure if this is the case, but what I can tell you is that very early Christian tradition attributes it to Matthew. So Irenaeus and Origen, both very prominent Christian thinkers and writers operating in the late 2nd century, attribute this book to Matthew, the ex-tax collector. So can't be sure. Not too sure exactly about the dating either, but early Christian tradition believed it was written by Matthew. Now, what's Matthew's purpose in writing his Gospel? Well, PhD theses have been written on this, so I'm going to give you 2 sentences or so. Matthew is writing his Gospel mainly for believing Jews. So for Jews who have, when I say believing Jews, I mean Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And so he uses a lot of Old Testament material to emphasize his points and to make his case. So, for example, we have a lot of fulfillment formulae in Matthew. I've got an example here from Matthew 4 verse 14, but there are many others that I could have chosen. Matthew 4 verse 14 says this, Jesus did such and such a thing so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. It's called a fulfillment formula, and Matthew is full of them. And we also, along similar lines, have the language of as it is written. So chapter 2 verse 5 is a good example here. So this is Herod's advisors, Herod's wise men, and telling him where the Christ is to be born. And it says, they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written. So it has been written. And we see that language a number of places. So Matthew's very interested in connecting Jesus with the Old Testament, and he does it in a very rich way. And I'm going to show you that, a little bit of that in a few minutes. So let's say something about the structure of Matthew. And how he arranges his material. So Matthew is one of two Gospels that has a birth narrative. Only Matthew and Luke have that. And the first 4 chapters of Matthew could be termed the introduction, really. The genealogy. Now let's just say something about the genealogy a minute before I go on. If you or I were writing a novel, and I'm not suggesting Matthew's a novel, but it's a gripping piece of narrative, or if we were trying to write a gripping piece of narrative, we would probably not start with a long family tree. We would probably not think that that was an exciting way to begin. Matthew does begin with a long family tree. Now, why does he do that? Is that because he's a really boring person who can't think of anything interesting, any attention-grabbing way to seize his readers? Not at all. This, as far as Matthew is concerned, is the most attention-seeking way to seize his readers. Attention-grabbing way, I should say. Because, as we have been learning, as we've been going through the Old Testament, we know that there is this promise hanging in the air that David will not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. And we know that that promise seems to have been lost in the exile, because the Davidic king, the last Davidic king, is taken away to Babylon. There has not been a son of David on the throne since then. And here's this question: has God's promise failed? We also know, of course, we know that it is through Israel that God is going to send the Messiah. And of course, Israel is descended from Abraham. So we need to see the connection with Abraham. We need to see the connection with David. We also need to see the connection with Judah, because Judah is the kingly tribe. And I've slightly gone out of order there, but I hope you get my point. So what does Matthew do? How does Matthew herald the coming of Jesus Christ? By showing us that this Jesus is the son of Abraham, the son of Judah, and the son of David. And I think his readers would have been on the edge of their seats, because they are understanding the point that he's making, the point he's driving home. Now, also in this genealogy, in chapter 1, we have 5 women unexpectedly making an appearance. We have Tamar, we have Rahab, we have Ruth, we have, is it 4 women? And we have Mary. Also in this chapter, we have some women making an appearance. So we have Tamar. I think we looked at her story before. We have Rahab. We have Ruth. We have Bathsheba, and we have Mary. And that's quite unexpected, and I'll touch on that again in just a moment. So we're in Matthew's introduction, the genealogy, the infancy narratives, the baptisms, and the very beginning of his ministry, when he goes into the desert, really, and calls his first disciples. Now, Matthew arranges his gospel around 5 great teaching blocks. So now we come to the first teaching block, chapters 5 to 7, which is, of course, the Sermon on the Mount. Then he shows us some miracles, and we get some miracles of healing in chapters 8 to 9. Then he returns to another great teaching block, chapter 10, the charge to the mission of his disciples, where he sends out the 12. Then we get some narratives around John and Jesus being rejected by the people of the day. Then chapter 13, we get the next teaching block, parables of the kingdom, and I'll just say a word or two about that in just a minute. Chapters 14 to 17, we've got more miracles, more discourses, more controversies with the Pharisees. We've got Peter's great confession of who Jesus is and the transfiguration. Then another important teaching block, chapter 18, where Jesus is really starting to talk about how people are to conduct themselves within the church. So, for example, if your brother or sister sins against you, what do you do? Or how are you to conduct yourself in terms of pride and humility? Chapters 19 to 22, Jesus's teachings, little bits of teaching, as it were, in Jerusalem. So small. One of the words that I probably slip out from time to time, so I might as well define it now, is pericope. Looks a bit like periscope without the S, and in fact, if you're not careful when you're writing it in a word processor, it auto-corrects to periscope, which is embarrassing. A pericope is like a self-contained little chunk of a gospel. So we get a number of pericopes in 19 to 22, bits of teaching and conversation and so on. The last great teaching block is 23 to 25, where Jesus speaks about judgment and the end of the world. And then, of course, in 26 to 28, we get the passion narratives, the account of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So these 5 great teaching blocks. Now, why 5 teaching blocks? And it's widely considered that the reason for this is because one of the things that Matthew is wanting to show us about Jesus is that Jesus is a bit like Moses, only better. So you may recall that at the beginning of Moses' life, we have him narrowly escaping murder by a despotic ruler. Of course, exactly the same thing happens with Jesus, who narrowly escapes being murdered by Herod, who sends his soldiers to Bethlehem. So we're already seeing a story that sounds a little bit like a familiar one from the Old Testament. We'll talk about the Egypt connection in just a moment. But then with these 5 great teaching blocks, Matthew is representing Jesus as being a bit like Moses, because the first five books of the Old Testament, known as the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, are widely considered to be regarded as the books of Moses. And so 5 books of Moses, 5 teaching blocks by Jesus. I think this is the reason that Matthew has organised his gospel in this way. So what is Matthew's theme? Well, I've said all the gospels, their theme is Jesus, but let's dive into that a little bit more. One of the things Matthew wants to show us is that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, we've spoken about the language of Messiah before. Messiah means anointed one, Messiach in Hebrew, anointed one. So the messianic language, we saw it quite a few times in the Old Testament. It's about one who is coming, who will exercise dominion. Do you remember that? But right back to the very first video, we talked about dominion being the call upon humanity to exercise dominion in the earth. And then that job description is applied to Israel, and it's applied to Israel's king. So the king is the one who's to exercise dominion, and we've had the prophets exploring what that dominion might look like. So the Messiah is the anointed one, is the one who is going to do that. Now, the Hebrew name Messiah is the same as the Greek name Christ. So whenever you see the language of Christos, which is Christ, this is saying the anointed ones. We quite often say Jesus Christ as if Christ was Jesus' surname, and you could go and say, hello, Mr. Christ. And of course, that's not the case at all. Christ is a title. It's like saying the anointed one, Jesus. And so Jesus as Messiah is one of the important themes that Matthew wants to show us. So let me show you one place where we see that language. Chapter 16, verse 20. And this is, well, let me just show you a couple of parts in this chapter 16. So this is Peter's great confession of faith. And Jesus has said, one of the things in the Gospels is whenever someone comes with a question to Jesus, he so often turns it around to effectively say, "Who do you say that I am?" I'll try and show you some of those as we go through. Who do you say that I am is one of Jesus's key questions, not because he was an egotist, which it would be if I kept asking that question, but because the most important thing that Jesus needs to communicate is that who he is, in order that people can put their faith in him. And so here in this little passage, Jesus says to his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they discuss the various possibilities. And then Simon Peter says this, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then verse 20, Jesus strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Messiah. So this is Peter's great declaration of faith here. Another thing that Matthew wants to tell us about Jesus, and this is very closely linked to the Messiah theme, is that Jesus is the son of David, as for the reasons that I kind of touched on a minute ago. So, for example, we have the blind man who calls out from the roadside, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy." In fact, two blind men in Matthew. Jesus, "Lord, son of David, have mercy on us." And a number of places we get that language being used of Jesus. Jesus himself refers to himself quite often as the Son of Man. And we have touched on this, we've looked at this when we talked about Daniel, because in Daniel 7, Daniel has this great vision of the Son of Man who is brought into the presence of the Ancient of Days and given all authority. And if you don't remember that, or if you didn't listen to the Daniel video, you might want to listen to that where we talk about that in a bit more detail. Jesus describes himself as the Son of Man, chapter 16, verse 27, for example. And then Jesus is described in Matthew's Gospel as being God's Son. There's quite a few places, I'll show you some of them. So in chapter 1, Jesus is revealed as God's Son who is conceived by the Holy Spirit and not by Joseph. Matthew is keen to emphasize Mary's virginity. At his baptism, the Father speaks from heaven and says, "This is my beloved Son." At the temptation of Jesus in chapter 4, the tempter repeatedly says to him, "If you are the Son of God, then..." So it's challenging his sonship, which obviously means the gospel writer is asserting Jesus' sonship. Chapter 11, Jesus makes a wonderful statement. "All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." So Jesus is the Son of God, the revealer of the Father. We've already seen Peter's great confession of him as the Messiah, the Son of God. And then in chapter 27 on the cross, Jesus is referred to as the Son of God. I think it's 3 times. Twice, kind of mockingly in the mouth of, in the mouth of the mockers. And it's interesting that in Matthew's Gospel, in the crucifixion account, people speak more wisely than they know. So people who are not trying to be wise, or who are people, there's a kind of deep irony with some of the things that are said to Jesus in Matthew's crucifixion account. So, for example, verse 40, those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourselves." And I'm digressing slightly, but of course, they think that he's talking about the bricks and stone, and they think he can't possibly, and the fact he's now on the cross has proved that his claim is nonsense. And what's actually happening is Jesus, who is the embodiment of the temple, and I'm going to show you that in a few days' time, a little bit more, is actually fulfilling that same prophecy that they are mocking him for now being unable to fulfill, if that makes sense. But then they go on to say, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." And again, of course, it is because he is the Son of God that he does not come down from the cross. And likewise, he trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he desires him. The irony, it is because he is the beloved Son. It is because he is doing God's will that God does not deliver him. For he said, I am the Son of God, they say mockingly. And then, of course, Matthew tells us that the very first person to declare who Jesus is after his death is a Gentile centurion, is the man who has been overseeing Jesus's execution, who says, truly, this was the Son of God. So these are some of the things that Matthew wants to show us about Jesus. Jesus is the new Moses. Jesus is the Messiah. He's the Son of David. He's the Son of Man. And he's the Son of God. And tomorrow we're going to explore a little bit more of some of the things that Matthew wants to tell us about Jesus and how to follow him.